In this video, we're going to talk about the most basic kind of quoting prose narration from a novel, from a short story, or from a nonfiction book. Remember that narration is the telling of the story. Everything else is dialogue, and we'll get into quoting dialogue in a different video. Quoting narration is probably the easiest thing you will ever have to do to comply with MLA. Here are the steps. First, find a quote. The quote should enhance the point you are trying to make. Essentially, you are using the author's own words to back up a point or a claim or an argument that you are making. That's a pretty slick trick. Let's say I'm arguing that Homer Hickham's determination to succeed made people want to help him even at a cost to themselves. I found a quote on page 87 of Rocket Boys that I think will back up my point. You can see that I have it marked in my book. I've got this whole quote marked, but I really only want to use the sentence in the middle. I know I must have looked pitiful because that's the way I felt. Second, write a good lead-in sentence. Your lead-in sentence should supply the context of the quote and introduce it accurately. In other words, it should tell your reader where you are in the novel by giving some clues about the plot. So here I'm going to show you how that looks. Homer approaches Mr. Bykowski for help, even though he knows his father would have disapproved. All right, that's all right for now. This next step, the third step, is to add your quote. Every word you take from an author's story must be in quotation marks. That punctuation tells the reader that you are using someone else's words. So let's go back to my example here. I'm going to add a space after my lead-in sentence. I'm going to begin my quote with, obviously, opening quote marks. Then I'm going to type the quote entirely, including all punctuation that happens in the middle of the sentence. I knew I must have looked pitiful because that's the way I felt. Okay, you'll notice that we're going to end with end quotation marks, of course, and then we're going to hit the space bar once, type in an open parentheses, and now if this is our first quote, we're going to type in the author's last name with a space and then the page number on which we found it. Then we're going to close the parentheses. Now, let's say that our quote ends with a comma, a colon, a semicolon, or a period. And ours, in fact, ends with a period. If it ends with one of those pieces of punctuation, you get rid of it at the end of the quote. Those pieces of punctuation do not carry meaning by themselves. They merely tell you to breathe. So we're going to get rid of that period. Then we go to the end of our quote parentheses, and we're going to end our sentence with a period. So you'll notice that the punctuation was removed from here, from this spot, and included in this spot right here. The only pieces of punctuation that would remain within the quotation marks are question marks and exclamation points. The reason that these stay is because they have meaning all by themselves. The sentence would be entirely different in meaning if it had one of those pieces of punctuation. So let's pretend that I have my sentence ended with an exclamation point so that I can show you what that looked like. I'm going to end it with an exclamation point. I'm going to end my quotes. I'm going to use my parentheses as usual with my page number and parentheses, and you'll notice that I'm still including a period here. That's because the exclamation point ends this sentence, the author's sentence, but the period is me ending my own sentence. So that's the way that would look if it ended with an exclamation point. Okay? But because ours doesn't, we're just going to keep it as is here. We get rid of the punctuation there, and we always end our sentence with a period. Okay? Now, the last thing that you do is you explain the significance of your quote. You write a sentence that explains the significance. Your reader is not interested in a translation. Presumably the author's words are better than yours. Explaining the significance is your chance to tell the reader why this quote enhances your point. So check this out. I've got my quote in, it's properly cited. I need the explanation sentence. Mr. Baikovsky's assistance suggests a desire to help the boys aspire to something beyond Coalwood. There we go. Altogether, I've used 3 sentences. I've got my lead-in sentence right here. I've got the quotation itself with my citation, and I've got a sentence explaining the significance of my quote. Now a word on ellipses. An ellipsis is a series of 3 periods which is used to indicate the omission of part of a quote. If the part that you omit changes the meaning of the sentence, use an ellipsis. If you eliminate a significant number of words from the middle of a quote, use an ellipsis. If your omission does not change the meaning, simply make the quotation a part of your sentence. You don't always have to quote complete sentences. For example, my quote could have looked like this. When Homer approaches Mr. Baikovsky for help, he knows he, and I'm beginning the quote now, must have looked pitiful because that's the way he felt. Okay, you'll notice here that I still have to end my quotes and then cite as usual. If this is the first quote, I'm going to use the author's last name. All subsequent quotes, I would use only the page numbers. You'll notice that I have included the word he in brackets. In the original quote, the word was I. But since using I made my sentence ungrammatical here, when Homer approaches Mr. Baikovsky for help, he knows that he must have looked pitiful because that's the way I felt. Suddenly we have a pronoun agreement issue. So we change this pronoun, which from an I to a he, which is a more accurate reflection of what happened in the sentence. I put the change that I made in brackets. These square brackets are your way of communicating directly with your reader that you have changed something in the quote in order to make it grammatical. Now don't get bracket happy except during March Madness. Use brackets sparingly. You want to try and avoid using them at all, but if you must, use them sparingly. So, couple of tips on using prose narration. Number 1, when you are reading the text for the first time, be on the alert for good quotes. Mark them with a sticky note or jot them down, jot down the page numbers so that you always know where they are. That will make finding them a lot easier when it comes time to write your paper. And finally, include a quote on your outline. That way you will have everything there ready to go when it's time to write.